There are people who try to control life as if it were an enemy. They tighten their grip on outcomes, routines, and identities, believing discipline means domination. Yet the harder they press, the more life resists. Chaos slips through their fingers. Fatigue builds quietly. The mind grows loud, reactive, impatient. The warrior who masters himself does something unsettlingly different. He releases the illusion of control over life and turns inward, where the real battlefield waits. Not against the world, but against impulse. Not against fate, but against his own untrained reactions. He understands that life does not need to be forced. It needs to be met. This kind of mastery is invisible. There is no performance. No announcement. No need to prove strength through aggression or certainty. When pressure arrives, he does not harden. When uncertainty appears, he does not rush to resolve it. His discipline is not rigid. It is rooted. Calm becomes his default weapon. Awareness becomes his armor. Because when the self is mastered, life stops feeling like something to conquer. It becomes something that moves with you, not against you. And somewhere deep inside, you may recognize this as the discipline you have been circling without naming. Chapter 1: The Awakening. He wakes before the alarm, not from discipline but from tension. The body knows before the mind admits it. Another day to manage. Another sequence of tasks to control so that nothing collapses. He tells himself this is strength. He calls it responsibility. Yet beneath the structure is a quiet exhaustion that no rest seems to touch. His days repeat with mechanical precision. Plans made, plans adjusted, plans defended. When something goes wrong, irritation flashes faster than thought. When something goes right, relief replaces joy. Life feels like a series of problems to stay ahead of. Even moments of silence feel unsafe, as if stillness might invite failure. This is the first misunderstanding. He believes discipline is the ability to force himself through life without breaking. But what he is really practicing is resistance. Resistance to uncertainty. Resistance to discomfort. Resistance to the truth that no amount of external control will ever produce internal steadiness. He notices it in small ways. The jaw tightening when plans change. The shallow breath when waiting for a response. The restless need to fill space with noise, movement, explanation. None of this feels dramatic. It feels normal. That is what makes it dangerous. There was a time when he thought mastery meant dominance. To dominate the schedule. To dominate emotion. To dominate outcomes. But dominance requires constant energy, and energy drains when it is fueled by fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed as insufficient. Somewhere in the middle of an ordinary moment, the realization begins to form. Not as a revelation, but as a quiet fracture. He sees that the world is not attacking him. Life is not testing him personally. The strain comes from within, from the reflex to brace against everything before it even arrives. This recognition does not bring relief. It brings discomfort. Because if the enemy is not life, then the battlefield has always been closer. It has been in the moment between impulse and response. In the breath before reaction. In the choice to tighten or to observe. There is a strange humility in this awakening. It removes excuses. It also removes blame. If life does not need to be controlled, then something else does. Not the future. Not other people. The self. He begins to sense that true discipline might feel less like force and more like restraint. Less like pushing and more like not being pulled. The idea unsettles him. It asks for responsibility without aggression. Strength without tension. This is where the cycle pauses, just briefly. Not because anything has changed yet, but because he has noticed the pattern. And noticing is the first act that does not require effort. The awakening is not heroic. It is quiet. Almost easy to miss. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. Chapter 2, The Ancient Principle. Long before discipline became a productivity slogan, it was understood as alignment. In old monasteries, discipline was not taught as control over life, but as intimacy with it. Monks did not rise before dawn to conquer the day. They rose to meet it without resistance. Their strength was not loud. It was precise. At the heart of this understanding is a simple principle. Suffering increases in direct proportion to resistance. When the mind argues with what already is, tension multiplies. When the body braces against reality, energy leaks away. The ancients saw this clearly. They did not call it psychology. They called it wisdom. In Zen practice, a student is often told to sit without adjusting anything. Not posture. Not breath. Not thought. The instruction sounds passive, almost careless. But within minutes, the nervous system rebels. The urge to move. To scratch. To correct. To improve. This is the untrained self revealing itself. Not weak, but restless. Conditioned to interfere. Modern neuroscience now gives language to what monks observed in silence. The brain is a prediction machine. It constantly scans for threat, error, and uncertainty. When it senses loss of control, it activates defense. Muscles tighten. Breath shortens. Thought accelerates. This response once protected survival. Today, it quietly exhausts it. Discipline, in its ancient form, was the art of not feeding this loop. A monk sweeping the floor did not rush to finish. He swept until sweeping was complete. Attention replaced urgency. Precision replaced force. Over time, this trained the nervous system to remain stable regardless of circumstance. Not numb. Stable. The principle was never about removing desire or emotion. It was about removing unnecessary reaction. When reaction drops, clarity appears. When clarity appears, action becomes clean. This is why ancient warriors studied meditation alongside combat. A sword guided by a shaking mind is dangerous to its owner. A calm mind does not need speed. It moves at the right moment. Nothing wasted. Here lies the quiet contradiction. The more one tries to control life, the more unstable the mind becomes. The more one trains the mind, the less control life requires. This shift is subtle. It does not announce itself. It shows up as a longer pause before speaking. A softer breath under pressure. A decision made without inner argument. These are not spiritual achievements. They are signs of alignment. There is a moment when this principle stops being theoretical. It arrives not during study, but during stress. When something goes wrong and the body does not immediately contract. When the mind observes instead of resists. In that moment, discipline reveals its original purpose. Not to dominate life, but to stop fighting it. And when that is felt, even briefly, something inside recognizes a different kind of strength, one that has been waiting patiently to be remembered. Chapter 3, The Internal War. The conflict was never visible from the outside. It looked like competence. Control. Someone who handled pressure well enough to be trusted. But inside, a quieter war was being fought every hour of every day. At the center of it is the nervous system. Not as an abstract concept, but as a living force that decides before thought ever arrives. When uncertainty appears, the body reacts first. Shoulders tighten. Breath rises. The mind follows with justification. Planning. Defense. What feels like rational control is often a biological reflex wearing a convincing mask. This is the internal war. One part of the self wants stability through control. Another part knows that control is unsustainable. The first demands certainty. The second absorbs reality. They pull in opposite directions, draining energy without visible movement. Fear is not the enemy here. Fear is information. The problem is speed. When fear moves faster than awareness, reaction replaces choice. The body prepares for threat even when no threat exists. Emails feel like danger. Silence feels like loss. Delay feels like failure. Over time, the system forgets how to stand down. Modern life accelerates this war. Endless signals. Endless comparison. Endless urgency without physical release. The nervous system was designed for short bursts of stress followed by resolution. Instead, it swims in a constant low-grade alertness. Not enough to fight. Not enough to rest. This is why discipline fails when it is treated as willpower. Willpower tries to overpower biology. It tightens against tightening. It commands calm while the body is still bracing. Eventually, something gives. Burnout. Numbness. Quiet resentment toward the very structure meant to help. The ancient insight was simple. You cannot win a war against your own system. You can only retrain it. Retraining begins with slowing the moment between stimulus and response. That gap is small at first. Almost imaginary. A fraction of a breath. But within that gap, the war pauses. Reaction does not disappear. It is seen. This is the point where most people turn away. Observation feels like loss of control. Doing nothing feels dangerous. Yet this is exactly where mastery begins. Not with suppression, but with non-interference. There is a strange relief when the body realizes it does not have to act immediately. Muscles soften. Breath deepens without instruction. The mind loses some of its urgency. Not because problems vanished, but because the system no longer mistakes them for threats. Here, discipline stops being aggressive. It becomes relational. You are no longer commanding the self. You are listening to it. And what you hear is not weakness, but exhaustion from years of unnecessary battle. The war does not end all at once. It fades through repetition. Each time reaction is noticed and not obeyed, the nervous system learns a new pattern. Safety without control. Stability without force. This is not a dramatic victory. It is a quiet ceasefire that deepens over time. And in that quiet, a different kind of strength begins to take shape. Chapter 4: The System. True discipline does not arrive as inspiration. It arrives as a system. Not a rigid structure imposed on life, but a simple order imposed on the self. The kind that does not negotiate with mood, emotion, or circumstance. This system begins with a single non-negotiable rule. The self is trained before the day is engaged. Not through intensity, but through consistency. Each morning becomes a signal to the nervous system that stability comes from within, not from what happens next. The warrior does not ask how he feels before acting. He asks what has been chosen in advance. Choice made ahead of time removes friction in the moment. This is the difference between discipline and struggle. Struggle debates. Discipline executes quietly. The system is intentionally small. One posture. One breath pattern. One period of stillness. Repeated daily without variation. Complexity feeds the ego. Simplicity trains the body. The nervous system learns through repetition, not explanation. At first, resistance appears. Not dramatic resistance, but boredom. Restlessness. The urge to optimize, adjust, abandon. This is the old self attempting to regain control through novelty. The system ignores this voice. It does not fight it. It does not argue. It simply continues. This is where identity begins to shift. The person who once relied on motivation now relies on structure. The one who chased intensity now respects rhythm. Nothing external has changed, yet the internal atmosphere becomes quieter, more grounded. There is a moment when effort drops away. Not because the practice becomes easy, but because it becomes familiar. The body knows what comes next. The mind stops interfering. In that moment, discipline stops feeling like self-control and starts feeling like self-trust. Halfway through the day, under pressure, something subtle happens. The breath returns on its own. The shoulders release without command. The pause appears before reaction. This is not willpower. This is conditioning. This is the system at work. Rules are few, but absolute. Practice happens even when it feels unnecessary. Especially then. Because the system is not built for crisis. It is built to prevent one. By the time stress arrives, the training is already complete. The warrior does not personalize failure. Missing a day does not collapse the system. He returns without drama. No punishment. No narrative. Consistency is measured over time, not moments. This system reshapes identity quietly. The question shifts from how do I control this situation to who am I when this situation arises. The answer is no longer theoretical. It is lived. Discipline here is not harsh. It is firm. Like gravity. Always present. Always reliable. It does not demand belief. It rewards participation. This is how the self is mastered. Not through force, but through design. Life no longer needs to be controlled, because the one meeting it has already been trained to remain steady. And from that steadiness, action becomes precise, calm, and unforced. Chapter 5, Practice Without Gaps. The system only works when it is lived without drama. Not perfectly. Not heroically. Simply without gaps large enough for the old patterns to reclaim authority. Most people fail here because they misunderstand consistency. They believe missing a day means failure. So when a day is missed, they miss a week. Then a month. Shame fills the space where discipline should return. The gap widens, not because of weakness, but because of a false belief in perfection. The warrior practices differently. He removes judgment from repetition. Practice is not a moral act. It is maintenance. Like sharpening a blade or cleaning armor. It is done whether the blade was used yesterday or not. Some days the practice feels deep. Some days it feels flat. Some days the mind is noisy and the body resistant. None of this matters. The rule is simple. The practice happens. Experience is allowed to vary. Action does not. This is how gaps are closed. Not by intensity, but by refusal to dramatize inconsistency. When life interrupts, the system bends but does not break. Shorter practice replaces longer practice. Simpler replaces complex. Something always remains. This trains a powerful identity. I am the one who returns. Over time, something unexpected occurs. The nervous system stops associating practice with effort. It becomes neutral. Ordinary. Like breathing or walking. Resistance fades not because it was defeated, but because it was starved of attention. There is a quiet transition here that is easy to overlook. Discipline stops being something you do and becomes something that is already happening. You notice it in behavior. You pause before reacting without remembering to pause. You keep commitments without internal negotiation. You recover from disruption faster than before. These are not signs of control. They are signs of integration. Practice without gaps does not mean rigidity. It means continuity. The thread is never dropped long enough to be forgotten. Even in chaos, even in failure, the thread remains visible. This is why the system survives real life. Not because life becomes easier, but because the practitioner stops disappearing when it becomes difficult. The warrior no longer asks if conditions are right. He adjusts the scale, not the commitment. The smallest version of discipline done today is infinitely stronger than the perfect version postponed. And in this way, without ceremony, the old cycle loses its grip. Control fades as a goal. Stability takes its place. Life moves as it will. The self remains. Chapter 6, The Quiet Reversal. There comes a phase where effort no longer announces itself. Nothing dramatic shifts on the surface. The same days arrive. The same pressures test the edges. Yet something fundamental has reversed direction. Earlier, discipline was used to hold life together. Now discipline holds the self steady while life moves freely. This reversal is subtle. Easy to miss if one is waiting for confidence or certainty to arrive as proof. What actually appears is neutrality. Situations that once demanded control now register as information. Problems arrive and leave without leaving residue. The mind still responds, but it no longer clings. The warrior notices this first in moments of disruption. A plan dissolves. A delay appears. Someone reacts unpredictably. The old reflex reaches for control, then pauses. Not because it was forced to stop, but because it no longer feels necessary. This is where trust replaces tension. Trust is not belief in outcomes. It is belief in capacity. The nervous system has learned through repetition that it can remain stable without interference. The breath does not need to be commanded. The mind does not need to rush. Action will emerge when needed. There is a quiet transition here, one that does not ask for recognition. Life is no longer something to brace against. As this reversal deepens, identity shifts again. Not into superiority or detachment, but into reliability. The warrior becomes someone others sense as grounded. Not because he offers answers, but because he does not add noise. His presence reduces urgency. His pace invites clarity. This is not a personality change. It is the absence of friction. Control once felt like responsibility. Letting go once felt like risk. Now both reveal their truth. Control was fear in disguise. Letting go is simply precision. The warrior still prepares. Still plans. Still trains. But these actions no longer carry emotional weight. They are clean movements, performed without inner commentary. The self is no longer dragged into every outcome. When failure appears, it is met directly. No collapse. No self-attack. Adjustment happens, then the system resumes. When success appears, it passes just as cleanly. No inflation. No clinging. The middle ground becomes home. This is the quiet reversal. Life has not become predictable. It has become workable. The warrior no longer needs to dominate uncertainty because uncertainty no longer dominates him. At this stage, discipline is invisible to others and barely noticeable to the one practicing it. That is how it is known to be real. Anything that requires display still depends on control. Here, the need to manage life dissolves. Not because life is easy, but because the self no longer leaks energy resisting it. What remains is readiness without tension. Movement without rush. Strength without hardness. The final transformation is no longer something to chase. It is already forming beneath the surface, waiting only to be named. Chapter 7, Transformation. Transformation does not arrive as a breakthrough. It arrives as a recognition. One day, without ceremony, the warrior notices that life no longer feels like something to manage. Events still unfold. Challenges still arise. But the inner urgency to control them has gone quiet. This is not indifference. It is intimacy without attachment. The self that once reacted has been replaced by a self that responds. Not slower. Not faster. More accurate. The space between what happens and what is done has widened just enough for clarity to enter. Within that space, the old fear finds no foothold. The warrior no longer defines discipline as effort. Effort still appears when needed, but it is no longer constant. Discipline has become orientation. A natural alignment toward steadiness. Toward presence. Toward reality as it is, not as it should be. There is a noticeable absence now. The absence of inner negotiation. The absence of self-surveillance. The absence of the voice that once demanded proof of worth through control. What remains is quiet readiness. A mind that can wait. A body that does not rush to defend itself. This is the identity that forms when mastery is internal. The warrior does not need to dominate circumstances because circumstances no longer dominate him. Pressure becomes a signal, not a threat. Uncertainty becomes terrain, not danger. Others may sense it without understanding why. Conversations slow when he enters the room. Conflict loses momentum. Not because he imposes calm, but because he does not carry tension into the space. His presence does not ask for resolution. It allows it. This is not the disappearance of ambition. It is ambition freed from anxiety. Action still happens. Goals still exist. But they are no longer loaded with self-worth. Success does not inflate. Failure does not diminish. Both are used, then released. The warrior understands now that control was never strength. Control was compensation. A response to an untrained self trying to survive a world it did not trust. Self-mastery removes the need for compensation. Life continues to be unpredictable. That has not changed. What has changed is the one meeting it. The nervous system no longer sounds the alarm at every variation. The mind no longer scrambles to secure the future. The body no longer braces against the present. This is the transformation. Not becoming invulnerable, but becoming stable enough to remain open. And in this stability, something ancient and precise settles into place. A quiet confidence that does not seek confirmation. A discipline that does not need to be enforced. A warrior who does not need control over life, because life is no longer something he stands against. So the final question is not how to maintain this state, or how to protect it. The question that remains is simpler, and far more demanding. Who are you when nothing needs to be controlled? Conclusion. The path described here was never about improving life. It was about removing the inner struggle that made life feel unmanageable. Control was not the problem. Dependence on control was. Through awareness, system, and continuity, the warrior learned something precise. Life does not require domination to be navigated skillfully. It requires a self that does not collapse under uncertainty. When the self is trained, life becomes workable. Not predictable. Not soft. Workable. This mastery is quiet. It leaves no symbols. No slogans. No visible achievements. It shows itself in pauses that no one notices. In reactions that never happen. In energy that is no longer wasted defending against what simply is. The warrior still acts. Still decides. Still commits. But the weight is gone. Discipline is no longer a tool for control. It is a condition of presence. The mind remains clear because it is no longer at war with reality. The body remains steady because it no longer mistakes change for threat. In the end, nothing mystical occurs. Something more demanding does. The need to control dissolves. Responsibility deepens. Freedom becomes quiet and ordinary. And if this feels familiar rather than inspiring, it may be because part of you has already been living closer to this truth than you realized.